Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's presentation on the birds of Newfoundland. This is our third session in the series, and this week we're going to be talking about ducks and loons. So I'm really pleased to have so many people here. I'm sure we'll have some people still trickling in the next little bit, but we'll just get started since we, as always, have lots of things to cover. So just a quick note to since we do have so many people, please keep yourself muted to limit background noise for everybody. And yeah, that should be all the housekeeping stuff. We are recording this session and we'll be posting it up on our website hopefully by the end of the week, and we'll send that link out to everybody in an email. So no need to scribble down a bunch of notes. You can watch this as many times as you want to. So again, welcome everybody. For those of you who haven't met me yet, my name is Jenna Mcdermott and I work for an organization called Birds Canada. Catherine Dale, who is also here and monitoring the chat, she also works for Birds Canada, and we are, as an organization, your voice for birds. So we are the leading science-based bird conservation organization in the country. And our mission is to drive action to increase the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of wild birds in Canada. And we carry this work out by conducting strong science and establishing innovative partnerships with other organizations and industries. We have offices all across the country, and we have a whole suite of different programs that are mostly citizen science programs. So that means that we have nearly 30,000, probably more than that at this point, volunteers nationwide who are all collecting data on things that they're passionate about and giving them to Birds Canada so that we can add them to our long-term data sets and help to conserve our birds like that. So currently in Newfoundland, we are running two different programs. We're running the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. And to learn more about the Atlas, we will be having one of our sessions for this series is on the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas, and it's on April 4th. So feel free to sign up for that if you haven't already. And a quick rundown of this project is that we're working to map the distribution of each of the species of birds that breed on the island of Newfoundland. So for example, this ruby-crowned kinglet that you can see here has so far in the Atlas in the last 2 years been seen at all of these different squares that you can see on the map there. And so over the next 3 summers, we're hoping to increase our information about where each of these species breeds. And this project is really carried out by volunteer citizen scientists, and people of any level of ability are welcome to participate, and they make everyone can make important contributions to the project, no matter your level of bird knowledge. Some other project, or the other project that we are doing here right now is the Atlantic Nocturnal Owl Survey. And it will be starting in the next couple of months, actually. So the basic rundown of the owl survey is that a volunteer can sign up to survey a route, and they go drive along this route once every early spring and listen to where owls of different species are calling. And then you record all of those on your data sheets and send that information in to us. So then we can map out where all of the owl species are breeding or are breeding as well. Yeah. So if you're interested in either of those, feel free to get in touch with us or come to our seminar on April 4th. Just before we get into the meat of things, I would like to quickly thank our partners and funders. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to do information sessions like this. So thanks to all of them. So this is what we will be covering today: Newfoundland's ducks and loons. I'm going to be focusing on the birds that are known to nest in Newfoundland, or that, even though we haven't recorded them nesting here before, there's potential that they could be nesting here. It's difficult to find ducks during breeding season, especially in Newfoundland. So I'm going to be covering some potential species as well. And I will say that winter right now, even though Ducks are not breeding right now. Winter's a really good time to be practicing some of these ducks because many of them congregate into large groups in areas of open water during the winter time. So you can see a lot of different species at once and just get a lot of practice for some of the similar looking species. So feel free to get out there and start looking for ducks tomorrow. Okay, so this is the rundown of what we're going to go through. I'm actually going to start with our loons, and we really only have one species of loon here that breeds on the island, and that's the common loon. And probably a lot of people are familiar with this species. It is superficially duck-like because it's found on ponds and lakes. It floats on the water, it dives under to get fish, but it looks a little bit different in that it has this really sharp pointed bill rather than that broad duck bill that people are likely familiar with. And the common loon has a red eye, and both the male and female look the same, and they have this sharp, very classy black coloration on their head and down across their back, along with this white checkering, white neck stripes, and they have a white belly and chest. And so common loons are always going to be found on the water. They're very uncomfortable on land because their legs are found so far back on their body, so they're not really good at walking. The only time you're going to see them on land is if you see one on their nest, and that's typically very close to shore as well. And as you can see in this little bottom picture, I added it for cuteness value. When the chicks come out of the nest, they don't know how to thermoregulate yet, and so their parents carry them around on their backs until they're old enough to thermoregulate to keep them warm under their feathers. So that was our loons. Now we're going to go right into all of the other ducks that we have to get through. So most people are pretty familiar with what a duck typically looks like, or the idea of what a duck looks like. So they're pretty large birds usually. They have a broad, flat bill, a thin neck and head on a pretty large, chunky body, and they have large webbed feet that they use for swimming, of course, and they're associated with water, but some can also be found on land. And so I'll just mention this one resource before we get started, because I'm using some illustrations from this guide, which is called Ducks at a Distance. It's a free guide you can find the PDF for online, and I'll also send it along in a follow-up email. And it's really good to help identify ducks in flight. It has illustrations of all of them. It also tells some information about flocking behavior and what they look like when they're flying. And it also, one really nice thing is that it shows close-up pictures of the speculum, which is the colored section of the wing on ducks. And these bright colored section of the wings are really good ID pointers for ducks. So all of the speculum illustrations that I'm going to show you today are from this guide. This guide also, interestingly, it tells you which ducks are good for eating or not, because I think it was made for hunters to begin with. And so today I am going to be showing you males and females typically in breeding plumage, but I'll also just note to you all that in ducks, there's another type of plumage called the eclipse plumage. And what that means is that in the middle of the summer, while females are sitting on their nests, the males will actually leave the family. Once the breeding is done, the males leave the females to raise the chicks, and they go to a different place to molt their body feathers. And this is called the eclipse plumage, and it's when they take on the plumage characteristics of a female. So as you can see here, we have a male mallard on the top in his bright, showy plumage, and then his eclipse plumage is here on the bottom picture, and he looks basically like a female. So most of the ducks do this and have some sort of eclipse plumage, but I'm not going to be covering that today. So ducks are split into two different categories. There's dabbling ducks and diving ducks, and they're going to be split into these categories in your field guides as well. So when you first see a duck and you're not sure what it is, it can be really a really good clue to take a look at its behavior and see if it's feeding on the top of the water or if it's feeding under the water. And that will really narrow down which species you need to look through in your field guide about which ones this duck likely is. So dabbling ducks do feed at the surface, and diving ducks feed underwater. They submerge their whole body. Dabbling ducks have their legs centered on their body, so you can also see them walking around on land. While diving ducks' legs are pretty far back on their body, so they're not going to be walking around on land very often, except for to go to nests usually. Dabbling ducks also have pretty large wings for their body size, which means that they can take off vertically. They don't need to have a running start or anything. They could take off from land, or they could take off straight from water. Whereas diving ducks have small wings for their body size, which means they need a little bit of a runway. You'll see them sort of running on top of the water before they actually make it into the air. And they also typically have quicker wing beats. And you'll also notice a little bit that dabblers sit higher up in the water, whereas divers tend to sit a little bit lower on the water, so you see a little bit less of the body. So we're going to go right into the dabbling ducks to begin with. So dabbling ducks are typically found in shallower bodies of water, like small ponds and marshes, because since they are feeding at the surface of the water or just underneath the surface, it's better for them to have accessibility to the bottom where they can pick insects off of plants and that sort of thing. And this is just a selection of the ducks that we are going to go through in a minute. We're going to start with the wood duck. And it's a large dabbling duck. And as you can see, the drake or male is a pretty unmistakable looking bird. It's very striking. Sorry. It has a bright red eye ring. It has white borders all around its chin, across its chest, and down along the wings. And it has a huge crest on the top of its head that's also bordered with white. The female, on the other hand, which is the picture below, is brown, for the most part brown, with a grayish head, and it has this white teardrop around its eye, which is diagnostic for a wood duck female. And they also have white edged primaries, and primaries are the feathers that are farthest away from the body on the wing. On the wood ducks, the speculum, which is the patch of color on the wing, is a dark blue bordered with a thin white stripe on the bottom, as you can see in the little wing figure on the left. And wood ducks, as you might wonder why they're called wood ducks, is because they nest actually in cavities. So the habitat that they prefer for breeding is actually in like flooded forests. So they like to have standing water surrounding trees. And you'll actually see wood ducks like standing on the branches, which is a very funny thing to think of, a duck in a tree. But they do nest in cavities, natural cavities left by woodpeckers, or also in nest boxes that are put up by people. We often see males around the island, but we don't have very many breeding records of wood ducks here. There have been some in the Cadre Valley, southwestern Newfoundland, and last year we had a successful brood in Deer Lake. So we'll move on to the mallard. This is a well-known duck. It's common during the summer across a lot of Canada, and it sometimes stays during the winter when there's open water. So it's a large dabbling duck again. And the drake or male is a very familiar bird with a bright green head, a bright yellow bill, and sort of brownish on the rest of it. And it also has always these curled tail feathers, which is unique for the mallard. Only on the males. The females don't have the curled tail feathers, and they're just a mottled brown color with an orange and brown bill instead. The mallard has, the speculum is dark blue, and it's bordered with white on both sides for both the male and the female. And mallards, they nest on the ground near ponds or in wetlands. And as you likely have guessed, they're often found nesting in city parks and areas like that. They're not very shy. So we also have the American black duck here, which is probably one of the most common ducks that you'll see around in towns and city parks, that sort of thing. And they're quite commonly found. They do breed in all of Eastern Canada, but they're not nearly as common elsewhere as they are in Newfoundland. And they're, again, a large dabbling duck. They're around the same size as the mallard. And they do actually look quite similar to the female mallard, only they're quite a bit darker in their whole body. So they have a dark brown body and a bit of a lighter brown head, and they have a line through the eye. The male and female look nearly the same as each other, except for the color of their bill. So the male's bill is an olive yellow color, whereas the female's bill is a dark olive color. And one way to tell the difference between an American black duck and a female mallard, if you're not quite sure, is to look at the speculum. And so in the mallard, the speculum was blue bordered with white, and in the American black duck, it's blue bordered with black. And I'll just mention, actually, because this can sometimes be confusing, is that a lot of ducks can hybridize with each other. So multiple species will mate and create a hybrid. And mallards and American black ducks are commonly hybridized. So if you see a duck that has characteristics of both a mallard and an American black duck, it's likely a hybrid. And other species do this as well, but this is just one really common one. Oh, and this is just a little extra picture looking at the speculum on the wing of this American black duck. And so you could see the black border around the blue patch there. So we also have gadwalls here, and they mostly breed in Western North America in the prairies and grasslands, and they are sort of rare in Newfoundland, but we do have records of breeding for them in the Cadre Valley again. And they nest on the ground near water, and they eat aquatic plants and invertebrates. So they're, again, around the same size as the mallard and American black duck, but they look quite a bit different, where the male is gray overall, and it has an extensive black area on its rear, and it has a dark bill. The hen, or the female, is, again, this mottled brown color, which is a bit of a trend with female ducks, in case you haven't noticed. And they have an orange edge on a dark bill and a little bit of a faint dark smudge around their eye. The reason that male ducks are usually so brightly colored and female ducks are usually brown is just due to the fact that female ducks are the ones that are incubating the eggs. So it's much harder to find, if you're a predator, a female duck who's brown versus a brightly colored male duck. So it's really a camouflage thing to avoid predation. So most of the ducks that we are going to see are have brown females. The speculum patch on gadwalls for both the male and female is white with black, and the male also has a little bit of a rusty brown patch on the wing as well. So the northern pintail is a really cool looking duck, and it's quite different from the ones we've seen so far. Even in the shape of it, the neck is quite a bit longer and more slender compared to the sort of more thick, squat neck of the last few that we've seen. And they have a long pointed tail, or the males have this long pointed tail. And they have a brown head with a white stripe that goes down the neck and into the breast, and the rest of them is gray. And the females are, again, a bit of a mottled brown color, but they have a plain face, so there's no markings or lines on their face, and that's really good diagnostic for them. The speculum in the northern pintail is green for the males, and it's sort of a bronzy color for the females. And so the northern pintail breeds across the island and is found all the way across Canada and into the Arctic. It's actually quite a northern breeding species. And so on the island, we've had them breeding in several locations in the past, including in western and northern Newfoundland. And they like to nest on the ground in sparse grassy vegetation in open areas, so they don't like wooded areas. And sometimes it can be quite far away from water. And once the chicks have hatched, they'll move the whole brood into a water or a wetland area for better foraging once they're hatched. We also have the American Widgeon in Newfoundland, which is a medium-sized dabbling duck. They typically breed near shallow lakes and marshes, and they eat submerged vegetation. And we only have records of breeding for American Widgeon in southwestern Newfoundland. In the winter, we also sometimes can see Eurasian Widgeon, especially if you're on the Avalon. And they have a rufous brown head, and a forehead patch on the male is a bit buffier. But the American Widgeon is the one that's more expected here. And they have a small blue-gray bill, which you could see on both the male and the female with that black tip on it. And the male has a distinct white cap on its head, and also this broad green stripe from behind the eye down to the back of the head. The female, on the other hand, is again mostly brown, but it has a gray head this time. And it has a dark smudge around the eye, so a darker area around its eye. The speculum for these guys is green, and the white patch that's above the green is somewhat reduced on the female wing. So we also have here the northern shoveler, and it's a very exciting looking bird as well because of its large shovel-shaped bill, which you could see on both the male and the female. On the male, it's black, and on the female, it's yellow or sort of olive yellow. And the male also has this dark green iridescent head, a white breast, and this big chestnut patch on its side. So it's really quite a striking looking bird. The female is again mottled brown, but that bill is really going to give it away as a northern shoveler. The speculum for these birds is green for both the males and the females, and the male also, as you can see in this picture that of the flying shoveler, has this powdery blue section on its wing. So northern shovelers, they mostly breed in Western North America as well, but we have had some successful broods in the Cadre Valley here and also in Deer Lake. So you never know what you're going to find. They like to nest on the ground in grassy areas and also sometimes far away from water, and so they'll move the brood once they've hatched into a wetland area. We're getting into some smaller ducks here. The blue-winged teal is quite small. It's a dabbling duck as well. Its nesting habitat includes wetlands, shallow marshes, and also temporary ponds. And so they move their breeding locations around each year depending on where they find the amount of water that they want. And in Newfoundland, we have found breeding blue-winged teal in southwestern Newfoundland and also on the Avalon. So the male, which you see on the top here, has this dark colored head with a distinct broad white crescent just between the eye and the bill. And then it has a mottled brown body, whereas the female is brown and has a dark eye line. So it doesn't have a pale face, it has a line through its eye. And it also, if you look really closely, has white arcs around its eye, so just these little white stripes on the top and bottom of the eye. And it also has a paler section at the base of the bill. In both the male and the female, they have this powdery blue section of the wing, and the speculum is green in the male, as you can see in the flying picture. So this is our final dabbling duck. This is the green-winged teal, and it's the smallest dabbling duck that we have in Newfoundland. It's about half the size of a mallard or American black duck. So it's really quite tiny. You'll notice it if you have a point of comparison for sure. The males have this lovely chestnut colored head, and they have a dark green stripe that goes behind the eye down to the back of the head. And they also have, where the ear is pointing, this very distinct white spur on their gray sides. So that's a good marker for the green-winged teal. The female is again a mottled brown color. It has a bit of a darker cap on its head, and it also has a darker line through its eye. If you remember to the blue-winged teal that I just showed you, and it had the white line around its eye, the green-winged teal does not have that. So it has, it doesn't have the eye arcs. And it also doesn't have quite the amount of paleness around the bill as the female blue-winged teal did. The speculum for the green-winged teal is green, as you would expect, and you could see it poking out from the female here at the bottom, and also see it in flight on the male. And it's bordered, it's green and black, and it's bordered with white bars. So the green-winged teal breeds in shallow permanent ponds that have lots of vegetation that are above the water, and they breed near forests rather than in open areas. And some do stay through the winter here. So I'm in Corner Brook. There's usually a green-winged teal down down by the pond at the inn there, and I'm sure there's plenty elsewhere on the island as well. They feed on seeds that they pick off the surface of the water or mud, and also invertebrates and tadpoles. So we'll just do a bit of comparison here to help us remember. We had two ducks that had green heads, two dabbling ducks with green heads. We had the mallard and the northern shoveler. And to tell the difference between these two, first we would like to look at the bill, because the northern shoveler's bill is very large and spatulate and is black colored, whereas the bill of the mallard is yellow and more of your typical duck shape. The body color is also different, where the northern shoveler has a white body with rusty flanks, and the mallard has a gray body with a chestnut breast. And we also had two ducks with a green eye stripe, and this was the American Widgeon and the green-winged teal. And so we tell the difference between these two by looking at the bill again. On the American Widgeon, it's a small blue-gray colored bill with a black tip, whereas on the green-winged teal, it's all one color and it's black. And as well, if we look at where the white patch is on these ducks, we'll see that on the American Widgeon, the white patch is on the forehead, and the white patch on the green-winged teal is on a small spur on the side. Perfect. So those were all of the dabblers that we expect to find in Newfoundland. And now we'll move on to the diving ducks. So this will be another section in your field guides. And we have quite a few diving ducks that that are expected to be in Newfoundland. So we've got a few to go through here. And just to remind you, these are the ones they dive completely underwater for food. Their feet are pretty far back on their body, and that's to help propel them underwater. And typically a dive for a diving duck lasts around 10 to 30 seconds, but they can actually stay for a minute or more under the water. And this is because they have a high tolerance for asphyxia, which is a lack of air. And so the oxygen that they have in the body is rationed to their vital tissues and their organs during their diving. And their heart rate is also reduced. And this is prompted by when water touches a certain receptor in their nostrils. And so when the duck has completed their dive and they're down at the bottom of water and they want to go back up, they just stop paddling and they'll pop up like a cork. Typically diving ducks that pop up in the same spot over and over again are usually hunting sedentary prey like clams. Whereas if they're hunting mobile prey like fish, then they'll pop up in a new location. So that's an interesting thing to think about while you're watching diving ducks. The first diving duck that we're going to talk about is the ring-necked duck. You might wonder why it's called the ring-necked duck, since it doesn't really seem to have a ring on its neck. But if you look at the top left picture, you'll see it has this sort of indistinct rusty colored ring. So that's not a clue you're going to look for when you're identifying a ring-necked duck, because it's incredibly hard to see. Instead, for the males, you're going to look for this nearly entirely black body. So they have a black back and head and chest, and they just have white on their flanks. They have a yellow eye, and they also have a ring around the bill. So I guess we could have called them a ring-billed duck, but it's not called that. For the female, it's brown overall, and it has a white ring around its eye. And it also has a pale base at its bill, and it does have the ring around its bill as well. The ringneck duck nests in shallow marshes or small ponds with forested edges, so it likes to have forest around. And the nest is actually constructed over the water on floating vegetation, so they need to do maintenance on their nest during the breeding season, especially if water levels change. And they are found all across the island here. We also have the potential for a lesser scaup. There's no records of them breeding here, but there is potential for them to breed here. So I've kept them on here so people can keep an eye out for them. They nest on the ground, close to deep permanent wetlands where there's lots of emergent vegetation, and that's just means vegetation that's growing out of the water. And that's because it has plenty of aquatic insects in there that they can eat. They also dive for clams and plants. And this duck looks somewhat similar to the ringneck duck that we looked at just now, but instead of the black on the back, it has gray on the back, which is an important mark to look for, especially if you're looking at this duck from a distance. They also have a yellow eye, and the female is again a dark brown overall, but they have this bold white patch at the base of the bill. So we're going to move on to the greater scaup. It looks very similar. And I'll do a little comparison slide after this one, but I'll just point out again, the greater scaup has a gray back instead of the black back, which was on the ringneck duck. So a gray back, it has the yellow eye still. And the female again is brown and has a bold white patch at the base of the bill. So what we're really looking for, I'll just tell you quickly, the greater scaup is more likely to be found here. We have breeding records from the Southern Avalon, the Burin Peninsula, and the West Coast. And typically they nest in long grasses on the edge of fresh water. So this is what we're really going to look for when you're comparing a lesser scaup and a greater scaup, is the shape of the head. And this might look like a bit of a stretch when you first look at it, but this is, as far as I know, the best mark to look for. And with practice, you can tell if you get a good enough look at these birds. So the lesser scaup has a peak at the back of its head where that arrow is pointing, whereas the greater scaup has a rounded head and it slopes down towards the back. So the peak is nearer to the front or the middle, or rather it doesn't look like it has a peak at all. But the lesser scaup definitely is going to have this peaked section at the back of its head. So it's tricky, but it's possible with practice to tell these two apart. Onto a more striking looking duck, we have the common eider. And interestingly, the common eider is actually where eider down comforters or duvets come from. It's actually from the feathers of this bird. Females, when they're nesting, pluck the downy feathers from their breast to line the nest to keep their chicks warm. And so in Iceland and some other places, there's colonies where farmers will collect the down once nesting season is over, and use it to create these blankets for humans. And it doesn't harm the ducks at all because they're already finished with the nest anyway. They are a colony nester, and they nest all along the coast of Arctic areas, as well as all around Newfoundland, especially on offshore islands. So we have quite a few eider colonies up in the north, up off the northern peninsula. So they are a large, heavy diving duck. They're quite substantial, and If you're looking at them from quite a distance and you're just looking at the shape, you'll notice that they have a sloped forehead that leads to this prominent bill. So rather than having a rounded head that points downward and then juts out into a bill, it's all sort of sloped into one. But they do have this yellow olive bill that stands out pretty well from the black patch on their forehead, and they're all white except for on the sides and the forehead, as well as the wings. For the male, the female is entirely brown, as you can see in this lower left picture. But again, you'll look at the shape of the bill and how it slopes into the forehead. It has the exact same shape as in the male. And I just have a picture of a male flying here at the bottom right, just to show you that they have all white along their back and into their wings as well. And so in the winter, we can also see king eiders, which is another species. And they have actually a black back, so they look quite a bit different when they're flying. Here's another pretty stunning looking duck, the Harlequin duck. This is a small, dark diving duck. If you see it from a distance or in not great light, it's just going to look like a dark colored duck, but these white patches are really going to stand out. So you can always look to see where the white patches are. And on the Harlequin duck, you can see it's along the face, on the back of the wing, along the neck, and along the chest. And then they have this bright sort of rusty patch on their side and a little stripe along the head as well. They have a bit of a small bill, especially compared to the eider that we were just looking at. And they have a bit of a longer tail for some of the ducks. The females are, again, typically mostly brown colored, but they have a round white patch behind the eye, and they also have a pale face between the eye and the bill. So it's getting more and more important to look at where the white sections are on these ducks so you can tell the difference between the species. Harlequin ducks are really interesting because they actually nest near fast-moving rocky streams. So they dive in and out of these fast-moving streams rather than in lakes and ponds, that sort of thing. So if you see a duck on a fast-moving stream, it's likely a Harlequin duck. And we don't have too many breeding records of them, but they're mostly known to be in the Northern Peninsula and also in some rocky bays on the south coast. And you can also see on this flying male that when they're flying, they have this white patch at the inside of the top of the wing. We also have the long-tailed duck here. They're interesting in that they have this really long tail, as you can see in the top picture. And they're actually present all along the Arctic. So they have a circumpolar distribution, and they are a rare but a regular breeder in the Long Range Mountains. And most people are actually mostly familiar with their winter plumage, which I have here in the bottom right. Because typically people don't see them very much in the breeding season since they are found in sort of more remote areas. And in the winter, the males, which is the one that's the long tail streamers that's at the bottom right, he actually completely inverts the colors. So instead of being a mostly white duck with some darker colors added, he actually turns into this one on the top and is mostly dark with only white patches on the flanks and a white patch on the face and some white tufts on the top of the head. So it's really quite interesting, the change in plumage between winter and summer there. The hen does a similar thing where in the winter it's far more white, and in the summer or for breeding plumage, you'll see the picture, this long-tailed duck female is sitting on a nest and she's mostly brown with only a white patch on the face. So now we're into the Skodas. There's 3 different Skodas that you could see in Newfoundland, especially during the winter. The surf Skoda doesn't have any records of breeding on the island as far as I know, but it's possible. that they are breeding and we just haven't found them yet, since they would likely be in more remote areas. So I've left them in here, but you can see them in the winter along the coastlines, floating around in large groups. And so it's good to get some practice of what they are. They nest in wooded areas near shallow freshwater like ponds, bogs, or tundra. So there's definitely a possibility they could be breeding on the island. So they are a medium-sized diving duck. And you can see the bill of the male is quite a striking color, this bright white and orange color. And it's also slopes into the forehead rather than being kind of attached on the front. It slopes into the forehead like we saw on the eider earlier. They also have a bright white patch on the forehead and a bright white patch on the back of the neck, as well as a white eye. Females, on the other hand, are brown again, and they have a white oval patch behind the eye and a vertical white patch behind the bill. And the orientation of that white patch behind the bill is quite important. And so I just also have here on the bottom a little picture of some surf scoters that are not in as good of lighting and a little bit farther away, but you can see that the bill and the white forehead patch is still very obvious to tell the males there. We also have black scoters, and you'll see them in the winter as well along the shore or the coastline, floating in groups like you see in the picture here. We just got our first breeding record for Newfoundland actually last summer for the black scoter in the Long Range Mountains. So that's pretty exciting. And likely there's some more scattered about that just people haven't found because they're probably in remote areas. They like to nest in large clumps of grass, and they eat small fish, plants, and crustaceans. So to tell them apart from the last scoter, as you can see, the male is this dark black one with a bright orange or yellow section on the top of the bill. And that's a diagnostic mark, is that bill coloration there. And the female is again brown, but she's different from the last one because she has a dark cap on top of her head, and the whole cheek down into the neck is pale compared to being darker with only small patches of white. I'll just mention there's one other type of scoter that can be seen in the winter, but is not expected to breed here at all, and it's called the white-winged scoter. And it also has a different face pattern in that it has a white teardrop mark behind the eye, but it's also a dark brown duck with a large bill. This is the common golden eye. So we also have another type of golden eye that I'll show you on the next slide. As you can see, it has a bright yellow eye, so it's rightly named. It's a medium-sized diving duck, and it has a short triangular bill, and the male has, again, this iridescent black head, and it has a round white patch, a big round white patch behind the bill. And it's got black on its back and white, they call them windows, but it looks like those stripes along the upper side there with a white body. The females are brown, they have a brown head and they have more of a grayish brown body, but they have the yellow eye as well and a mostly black bill. And common golden eyes are interesting because they also nest in cavities. So they go to the same cavity typically every year, and this could be old woodpecker holes or nest boxes or natural tree cavities. And this cavity that they nest in is often near deep lakes or ponds that have high invertebrate numbers. And common golden eyes, you can also sometimes hear them when they're flying because their wings will whistle when they fly. This is the other golden eye that I mentioned that we have, the Barrows Golden Eye. And as far as I know, we don't have any breeding records here, but it's thought to be extremely likely, especially in the Long Range Mountains. So it's maybe only a matter of time before we find one breeding. And they nest in wooded or open country near lakes or ponds surrounded by dense vegetation, usually again in a natural tree cavity. such as an abandoned woodpecker hole, or they could also nest in nest boxes or a rock cavity or along a stream bank as well. So there's a bit of variation there. And they'll often go back to the same area to nest every year as well. For the Barrows Golden Eye, it also has a short triangular bill and a yellow eye. But the shape of the white on the face of the male is a crescent shape instead of a circle. And they also have this dark spur that goes down the shoulder, and they have more black on their back rather than more white. For the female, it looks quite similar to the common golden eye that we just looked at. It's got a brown head and a grayish brown body, but it has a mostly yellow bill. So we'll just compare the two here on this slide, so it's a bit easier to tell. So the males are on the top there. Take a look at where the white is on their face and the shape of it. And see that the Barrows Golden Eye has a crescent shape and the common golden eye has a round white patch. And then look at their back to look at the amount of black and white on there, as well as how the black extends down past the shoulder in the Barrows Golden Eye. So those are the best marks for these guys. The females are incredibly difficult to tell apart, especially if they're at a distance or not great lighting. But ideally they'd be with their matched up male. Oh, and there's just also one other difference when they're flying. You can see in the common golden eye that's on the right, in the wing, there's far more white on the wing, on the top of the wing, whereas the Barrows Golden Eye has a bit of a black stripe between the two sections of white on the wing. So that's something to look out for if you see them flying. So we'll move into the Mergansers now. I'm going to tell you about 3 different Mergansers. Mergansers are also diving ducks. They feed on fish typically, so you'll see them popping up in different locations than where they dove down. And they all have a very thin bill, that's diagnostic for Mergansers. This is the hooded Merganser. You could tell that it has this huge crest on its head for the male, and the female as well has quite a large crest. And on the male, it has a big white patch on the crest. If you look in the top left corner, sometimes they will have it not quite as raised up as in the middle picture. It'll be a little bit squished, so it's a bit of a different shape to look for, but still has that big white patch behind the eye. They also are mostly black otherwise, with a couple of white stripes and brown sides. Whereas the female is brown again, as you maybe expected, but they do have that big crest on the head. And so that's something to look for them. The hooded merganser also nests in cavities. We don't have any breeding records for Newfoundland, but there are often groups of males seen during the summer at the same time that females should be sitting on nests. And so the potential is there that there's hooded mergansers breeding on the island, and we just haven't found them because they're somewhere where people are not going. So they nest in cavities in forested wetlands. And then we also have red-breasted mergansers. And these are a large diving duck. You can see again, the shape of the bill is quite thin and red. The red-breasted merganser also has this red eye and a very shaggy crest, like a mohawk, that's both on the male and the female. The size of the crest, you can't necessarily always believe the size of the crest when you're looking to tell species apart, because if it's wet or if they're more relaxed, then sometimes it's a bit more hidden, so it might look smaller, and you might not expect it as a red-breasted merganser. So look at other markers as well. So for example, on the male, the coloration is quite striking. It has this iridescent dark head, as well as a white collar on its neck and a brown or a chestnut brown throat and breast, as well as a black back and some gray sides. The female is mostly gray-brown on the body, and it has a brown head. And for the female, it's important to note how the colors change through the neck. So you'll see that the brown head sort of slowly diffuses into the paler color of the throat. And so keep that in mind when we get to the next species. The red-breasted merganser nests on the ground rather than in a cavity like the other ones we talked about, in marshes or forested riverbanks, or it could also be on rocky or vegetated islands, so it's a little bit variable. And the female also often lays her eggs in other species' nests, and other species lay their eggs in her nest. This is our final merganser, and actually our final diving duck. So it's the common merganser. And it's again a large diving duck. And these, on the male this time, it doesn't have a crest. As you can see, it has a very smooth head and neck that's all black that goes into a black back, and their front and flanks are completely white. But they again have this thin bill, this thin red bill that we've seen in the other mergansers. And the female here is gray, has a gray body again, and with a brown head. But unlike the red-breasted merganser we had just looked at, the change between the head color and the neck color is quite abrupt here. So you see a definite line of where the brown head ends and the gray neck begins. And so that's a diagnostic marker for the females to tell the difference between a common merganser and a red-breasted merganser. The common merganser also has this white chin. You could just see a cute little picture on the bottom. They also will carry their chicks around on their back before they can thermoregulate. Okay, so that's all the species we're going through today. And you may be overwhelmed thoroughly by all the different ducks at this point. And they take a while to learn, but if you start by learning the males, you'll have an easier time because they do have these brighter colors that we were just looking at. It's also good to use this question, where is the white? So even if you're seeing a duck at a distance or in poor lighting, the white sections of the duck are typically going to stand out, even if you can't see the rest of the colors. So we have here a green-winged teal, a northern shoveler, and American widgeon. And even if you only saw a poorly lit version of them, you would still be able to tell where the white was and how it's different from the others. So you would still be able to tell the species. So that's a good point to use if you're looking at ducks out in the world. Look at where the white is. And I'll just quickly mention tips for identifying female ducks because as you've seen, they are mostly brown, with only small sort of clues about what their species might be. And it could be confusing if you see them alone. So definitely try and learn the shape of the duck from the males. So typically you may find a pair together, so you'll be able to compare the male and the female. So the shape will be the same between the male and female, even if the coloration is different. You'll especially want to look for patterns on the head, like lines through their eye or where the white coloration is, and take a look at the color in the wing of the speculum. And just take your time with the female ducks. It might take some years to figure them out, but you can figure it out one day for sure. And that's going to bring us to the end. So thank you, everybody, for your attention today. I hope that you've learned some things about identifying ducks, what ducks we can find here on the island, and what ducks maybe are breeding and we don't even know about it. So hopefully you can keep your eyes open when you're out at the cabin and seeing what you could see. And I'm happy to take any questions. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Jenna. Great job taking us through the ducks. There have been a couple of questions in the chat that we've been talking about a little bit while you were telling us about the ducks. One question that we've done a little bit of digging into, but perhaps you know the answer. Mallard and black duck hybrids, are the hybrids infertile?
That is a good question.
Right? Surprisingly good question.
Yeah. I'm actually not sure. Did you find anything from your digging?
So I don't think they are, because there are mentions of back crosses, which is when a hybrid
Okay.
breeds with one of the parental species. But there is some suggestion, at least from the late 90s, that hybrids are selected against, so they may not be as successful as
Yes.
the pure species.
Well, that's very interesting. I'm glad that you did the digging because I didn't know the answer right off the bat.
Neither did I. It was a great question, because we do have this perception that hybrid individuals are often infertile. So it was
Yeah.
a very good question. And then somebody else asked about the best time to go to the Cadre. And I thought, since I know you've been several times, I had a few things to say, but I thought you'd be a good person to ask.
Yeah, the Cadre is a super interesting place because there's a really high diversity of birds there. And if you go in the early spring, you probably see the most birds or the most species that are around, and most of the males will be singing and everything like that. So the spring is definitely when you go to see the most birds there.
Yeah, I said June. I think a lot of people go in June, and that's sort of our peak for the breeding bird atlas as well.
Yeah, for sure.
We have a question here about the ducks you covered. Are they both freshwater and ocean dwelling?
So that's a good question. And all of the ducks that I've covered, they are nesting in freshwater. But they can be found on the ocean or in saltwater, especially in the winter time. Or ducks are somewhat complicated in their breeding because of what I was mentioning with the males leaving the nesting females. And so the males could also be found in the middle of summer on saltwater as well. But then they might be in their eclipse plumage, so they may look more like females.
So actually, that leads us into another question. So Trina has asked, how long do they have sort of the breeding plumage versus the eclipse plumage versus winter plumage?
Yeah. Yeah, ducks are really interesting. So ducks are going to already be in their breeding plumage right now. So they're pairing up in the winter when they're on their wintering grounds. So they're all in their fancy breeding plumage starting probably as early as December. I'm not sure exactly when. I'm sure it changes between species. And then so the males will go into their eclipse plumage in the middle of the summer after their part in breeding is over and they've laid, the females have laid the eggs. The males will then go into eclipse plumage. The females will be in breeding plumage sort of looking the same year round for the most part, but they will still molt all of their body feathers either while they are still taking care of chicks in the summer or a little bit later into the fall, but they'll typically look the same year round or fairly similar year round.
Thank you. We also have a question here about tufted ducks. So Albert says he's seen tufted ducks several times. Do they typically breed in Newfoundland?
Yes, I meant to mention tufted ducks actually, and I forgot to, so thank you for bringing that
They're
up.
my favorite, Jenna, the tufted ducks. They're so silly.
They are very silly. They are visitors from Europe. So they're typically only here in the winter. So we don't expect them to be breeding in Newfoundland, as far as I'm aware.
But if you come across it, we'd love to know about it.
If you come across it, absolutely let us know. But we are not expecting that they're breeding here.
No, but they are reliably, at least in the St. John's area, they're here every winter very predictably.
Yeah.
There have been a few questions about the best places in the Cadre, and I see that Megan is jumping in here too. So either I have not been to the Cadre, much to my sorrow, but Megan and Jenna are both experts. So would you recommend any places in the Cadre? And Megan, if you want to unmute yourself and offer advice, you can feel free to do that.
Sure, I guess it depends on what birds you want to look for, because there's a lot of different varieties, as Jenna had already mentioned, and it depends on what your interests are. Oh, sorry, my clock is going off. And yes, it's a bird clock, I'm sorry. There's, if you want to see something like, there is a couple spots where piping plovers although we do want to give them space. We want to make sure they have their space. So usually for them, we want to stay back. It's either you work on the wet sand to avoid their nesting habitat, or stay off the dunes completely in the whole area and just kind of observe from a distance with binoculars. There's the Cadre Provincial Park down there, Cadre Valley Provincial Park. That's a spot that there is breeding populations of piping plovers. You'll also get some coastal birds there as well. If you go to, let's see here, there's O'Regan's, there's Brook Road in Cadre, Upper Cadre, I guess, area. Those are really good spots for looking for warblers and things like that. There's also Loch Lomond and a couple of ponds. You're going to find a whole bunch of different swallow species, and you find red-winged birds, a bunch of your ducks that you were talking about here tonight. And you'll also find different warblers and flycatchers around those ponds as well. So Loch Lomond and Shoal Pond are 2 ponds that birded a lot, kind of right in the Cadre Valley and that area. It really depends on what you want to see, because you can also get terns right down at the kind of parish area across from where the plovers are breeding as well, and they're down there too. But yeah, it really depends on what you want to see. And I don't know if you have some other suggestions.
I think you covered that perfectly, Megan, and I don't think I could add anything else other than if people already know about using eBird. It's just an online database where everybody who wants to can submit their birding information, and so you can look on there and see where most people have gone to the Cadre, and that'll probably cover most of the locations that Megan was just talking about. And someone asked if we can add those locations to the recap email, and yes, I will add that to my list to put it in the recap email.
We can definitely, I'd like to know that too. Just to quickly cover a couple of questions that people put in the chat. Somebody asked if there was a Nova Scotia breeding bird atlas. There is a Maritimes breeding bird atlas that covers all 3 Maritimes provinces. There are actually 2 of them, because atlases are designed to be done every 20 years, so you can track what's going on with populations. The most recent one, the second one, happened from 2006 to 2010. So it does exist, but unfortunately it is not online. You actually have to get the hard copy of the book, and I believe you can't get them anymore. I think they printed a certain number and they're done. But there will be another Maritimes breeding bird atlas in theory in I guess a few years, which is a slightly scary thought. And then the other question was, does proof of breeding equal ducklings? And yes, that is absolutely the best proof of breeding, but we consider a lot of different cues about breeding to constitute proof of breeding for the atlas. And so if you come to our atlas session on the 4th of April, we'll be talking about what counts as proof of breeding for different birds. And yeah, it gets a little bit complicated, so I'm not going to go further than that today.
I will jump in. Trina has sort of followed up on her question about proof of breeding, and I do understand what you're saying, because if we're trying to ID males first for newer people, and they're not necessarily the best breeding evidence since they're moving around so much, what do we really do? And I'll say that if you can possibly get a picture of females with ducklings, that can really be helpful to either send to us and we can try to ID them for you, or if you're involved in the Newfoundland and Labrador bird watching Facebook page, if you're on Facebook, people on there are also super helpful with helping with identifications for birds as well. So you could try that too. Or if you're not sure, you don't want to do either of those things, just keep on learning. And I mean, it'll be fun for you to know what ducks you're looking at either way.
I stand corrected. You can actually get the Maritime Breeding Bird Atlas online. I did not think that was online, and I'm not sure all of it is, but you can definitely get some of it. And the site has actually been put in the chat there, so thank you. Yeah, Birds Canada and Sackville would also be the people to ask. And You can request a data download for, I believe, any of the breeding bird atlases. So you send a request to Birds Canada and you can get at the data that way. So there's that as well. The other thing, so again, different things constitute breeding evidence for different species, but obviously finding a nest, seeing egg shells, all of that counts as breeding evidence. And for a lot of birds, seeing them paired counts as breeding evidence. However, that gets a little complicated with the ducks because, as Jenna said, they pair far away from their breeding grounds. So just because you see a pair of ducks together doesn't necessarily mean that they're breeding where you see them.
That's true. But I will also say we're working on making a document that people can use that will indicate when it's safer to assume that birds are breeding where you see them. Did that make any sense?
Yes, absolutely. So if you see a duck in the middle of its breeding season, you see a pair of ducks, then it's safer to assume that they are in fact breeding.
Yes,
because chances are they aren't on their way somewhere else.
Yeah.
Okay, it looks like I think we've gone through all of the questions here. Does anybody else have any questions? I'm not seeing more come into the chat.
David will be very excited for you to come back atlasing again. In
Absolutely.
2022.
Okay, I think that's it for our questions. So thank you very much, Jenna. Great job.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for coming, everyone. Have a good evening.